Thank you so much for tuning into this video. My name is Meredith and I'm going to be chatting with you about Saturn in the 7th through the 12th houses and what that can indicate for you if you have these placements natally. Again, Saturn can pose sort of a limiting or a constrictive influence in whatever house it's placed that then changes shape over the course of time when someone goes through what's called their Saturn return between the ages of 28 to 30. And then Saturn can definitely cause lessons and, growth periods throughout someone's life based on where it is in their chart. And so learning that can really help to expedite a lot of the growth that, if you're say 26, 27 and you're like, how can I get ahead of my Saturn issue? Or you're listening to this and you're like, yes, 28 to 30 was like one of the most strenuous times in my life, then you can use Astro Matrix has a birth calculator where you can find where your Saturn is placed, and you can also find what it means for you. Just check in the link in the description box below for that. So without further ado, I'd like to get into Saturn being in the 7th house. So the 7th house is the house of relationships. It's really the house of like all other people outside of yourself. So with Saturn, which is the planet of obstacles and challenges, going into the house that we tend to sort of disown or disconnect ourselves from, we say, no, that's not me, when we talk about our 7th house of other people, relationships, friendships, that kind of thing. So when Saturn comes into the 7th house, we can see partners come into their lives that are very responsible, maybe a little older, values maybe like more the practical things in life. And you can see it's like these people attract the grown-ups, so maybe sometimes they don't feel like they're the most practical or the most grown-up. I would advise a Saturn person in the 7th house not to get married before they're 28 to 30, because you tend to run into some challenges in that marriage after the Saturn return takes place, because we fundamentally change as people. So, usually that relationship, not always, real love is out there and real love exists, but sometimes Saturn in the 7th house can have a hard time as well with projecting problems that they have within themselves onto their partners, and just difficulty as well with choosing the proper friends and proper romantic partners and business partners. So there tends to be a lot of learning in these areas. And then after the Saturn return, there's like this upward trajectory in the story arc where somebody really actually understands how to conduct relationships properly. So getting into Saturn in the 8th house. So the 8th house is a very deep, dark place. It is like the underworld. It is like where all of our psychologically buried things are. And the 8th house is an interesting place. It's the house of crisis, trauma, transformation, death and rebirth, the cycles that we go through that really take us through our own hero's journey and transformation, as well as loss and intimacy, shared energy, shared resources, that kind of thing. All of these things, can be kind of challenging with Saturn in the 8th house. Like when it comes to being close to people. So someone might be like very likable, personally popular, whatever, depending on what they have in their chart. Like maybe they have Venus in the 1st house or something, but this same person, when it comes to really opening themselves up to people and getting closer to people, they can find it very challenging, I'll say that. And as well, we can find people who have a hard time really looking into their their shadow, their trauma, their darkness, but these same people are like constantly like pushed up against that kind of stuff, like difficult situations that can sometimes be, you know, traumatizing. They're like pushed up against those things until they like embark upon this often soulful and karmic push to like dive really deep into their stuff and to get really clear and to really heal, which is why you tend to see people like this with Saturn in this position. Sorry, there's literally an elk in the river. So you tend to see people with this position of Saturn, you know, become like the esoteric leaders and, you know, the people who really are understanding energy and understand pain and understand emotions, because they really had to go through a lot maybe to understand it for themselves. You know, difficulties with inheritances, with death of loved ones can definitely come up and be a catalyst for change. You know, a lot of people who get married with this placement of Saturn don't necessarily like feel comfortable like sharing finances, or there can be a lot of like either giving yourself away or like hoarding yourself back. So, you know, obviously that's a very nuanced situation, right? With Saturn in the 8th house, it can take on many forms, and I'm not sure if I've said this yet, but you should definitely check out the sign that Saturn is in, because that's going to give you a lot of indication about the way that Saturn behaves in each house. So yeah, let's talk about Saturn in the 9th house. This is one of my favorite placements actually for like friends and having like people to talk to, because these people are like the thinkers and the philosophers, but truly, you know, the 9th house is the house of higher learning, academia, but also like spiritual philosophies. I think of like hidden history, or like you know, like the mysteries. Like the 8th house is like the inner mysteries, and the 9th house is like the mysteries of our world, you know. So I'm not a really big fan of ancient aliens, but I think that like, you know, truth seeking is a very 9th house thing. And to me, like, these are the researchers. These are the people who find everything to be skeptical about when it comes to spirituality, the way that the ancients lived, science, everything. Like, these people are so skeptical naturally, and it's a great thing, because usually these people are like the experts of the experts in their field, because they take the time to go through everything, to look at the primary sources, to look at all of the research. And, you know, these people wind up being very like cerebral and academic, depending on like what their area of expertise and what they wind up studying actually is. You know, it looks different for somebody who's interested in archaeology than it does someone who's interested in like ancient, you know, Vedic texts and bringing those out. You know, there can definitely be a sense of like feeling misunderstood, or like feeling a little bit alone in terms of like being the only critical thinker in the room, maybe for someone with Saturn in the 9th house. And as well, you know, you can find people who, I don't know, there's just there can be a real disconnection from God. Like, not that we're not all connected to God. It depends on how you feel about that. But with Saturn in the 9th house specifically, it's like, ideally they wind up at like the quantum physics and faith and like, you know, and learning about their own mental power, because, you know, there's just a lot of like innate separation. Like maybe they grew up in a religious household, and a family maybe that wasn't you know, open-minded, or, you know, whatever the belief system is when they're growing up, it tends to change, especially around that like magical window between 28 to 30. So that's Saturn in the 9th house, and we'll move on now to Saturn in the 10th house, which is one of those really interesting placements where like you really don't see where it's going until like later in life. Saturn is the natural ruler of the 10th house. It has to do with career, legacy, someone's life work. I think of like the 6th house as like the smaller steps that you take in the career to get to the 10th house, which is like the real, like, this is what I've done in my life, this is my contribution. So when someone has Saturn in the 10th house, they can have very difficult times with authority, with bosses, with one of their parents. One of their parents may have like really, impressed upon them the importance of a certain type of maybe more traditional success. And then maybe it's up to them to redefine success for themselves as like an independent adult. And especially like when they get into that 28 to 30 range, it tends to look like, well, this is what success used to look like for my family. Maybe if their family had expectations of them getting a job as like a doctor or a lawyer, like one of the more traditional careers, and then they say, hang on a second, this is actually what works for me. With Saturn in the 10th house, there's all of these little steps that you take up the mountain, and then it's like you work your whole life and then you look back and you're like, whoa, I cannot believe that I've done all of this stuff, or that this led me to this, led me to this, led me to this, led me to this. So if you are before your 28th birthday and you are a Saturn in the 10th house person, don't worry. The steps that you're taking now do actually matter for the bigger picture of your career. Just stay with it. These are the most hardworking folks that you could imagine. Just sometimes they have to find their own rhythm with it, and they have to have a purpose and a reason, like, really, that wakes them up in the morning and that like gives them, the ability to motivate. They're not going to get motivated for like a 9 to 5, I don't think. There has to be something meaningful and like a meaningful contribution to humans. So let's discuss then Saturn in the 11th house. The 11th house is one of the hardest houses, in my opinion. Like, when you're learning astrology, the 11th house and the 12th house are some of the hardest to understand and to kind of like comprehend and get your head around, because the 11th house definitely does have to do with like networks and friends and social groups, and it's also like your orientation to the world at large, your orientation to the future. It's your orientation to like your picture, like your part in the future and in the collective. And then how you see that tends to determine, the good fortunes or not that come to you, right? So we think of the 11th house, of course, as the house of like groups, communities, friendships, like networks, like the internet, or like an Alcoholics Anonymous type of program. Those are two examples of things that are very like 11th house-ish, right? Groups, networks. But there's also this other part of the 11th house that has to do with the hopes and gains or the gains and windfalls and good luck that you receive as a result of what might be your orientation to the world. So when we think of Saturn, which is like a very limiting type of influence in this part of your chart, you're gonna kind of be a little bit more like naturally pessimistic. I don't think that you see the world through rose-colored glasses. Maybe you see the world as like a harsh place, and that does very much have to do with the formative friendships that someone with Saturn in the 11th house makes. There can be some sense of like betrayal or isolation or like not feeling a part of. And that's the main thing with this placement, is that with Saturn in the 11th house, you can tend to feel like different from your environment. And I don't think that it's necessarily good, quote, whatever, to feel connected all of the time to everyone, like to really be in that space, because then maybe you wouldn't be a human. But to feel so separate and so alien from those around you is definitely a Saturn in the 11th house experience, and one to really reconcile with. You tend to keep quality over quantity when you have this placement, and there is a having to find your tribe of misfits in the world, and feeling like a black sheep, that tends to come with it, as well as maybe some existential dread about humans and the world, and like, because you feel so separate from it, some people, like, okay, I think of Pisces placements, for example, as a sign that can benefit from separating a little bit from other people, because they can tend to go right into the experience of another. And I think Saturn in the 11th house really can benefit from like taking, like, kind of, peeling back a little bit and taking steps. Well, Pisces placements, sorry, can benefit from taking a step back. Saturn in the 11th house placements can benefit from taking a step forward towards other people and maybe putting themselves in social situations. The people that you meet during your Saturn return from 28 to 30 could be some pretty important people in your life, like very influential, very pivotal to like your mission, because with the 11th house there's definitely a mission, a being of service. And sometimes that can make you feel used if you have your Saturn in the 11th house. I have some friends that have shared with me that experience that they've had. So now we'll go on to the 12th house. And like I said, the 12th house is a very hard house to understand as well. The thing that pulls the 12th house together in understanding, in my opinion anyway, as someone who deals with the astrology of the soul, is spirit. And the fact, well, this might be a fact to some, but that we have other lifetimes that we experience. And there's a lot of bleed over, because in the 12th house time doesn't really exist. So there's a lot of bleed over between all of our lifetimes, in my opinion, when somebody has like a strong 12th house. So when you put Saturn, also things in the 12th house tend to go away unless someone is seeking them, and seeking them through usually the realm of spirituality. So Saturn has to do with partially self-protection and self-preservation mechanisms, or like, the fatherly urge to protect is very Saturnian on some level, at a high level. So what can happen is these people with Saturn in the 12th house can sometimes lack, depending on the sign, depending on the aspects, they can lack self-preservation. They can sort of like be a wide open person, and that can lead into having a lack of boundaries and getting taken advantage of. There can be a hard time connecting sometimes to the stuff of this world, or there can be a hard time getting out of the confines of this world. It just depends on how it shows up. I would recommend to anyone with Saturn in the 12th house to do some spiritual work, because the 12th house can definitely go escapist. It can go delusional. It can go detached from, reality. But when Saturn in the 12th house goes spiritual, goes sober, goes reflective. One moment. Anyway, when Saturn in the 12th house goes inward, goes reflective, connects to their higher power or their higher self, this is where we really begin to see like the sage, the wise one, the person who has an understanding of things beyond, a third dimensional perspective. But it can take sometimes like trials and the universe slapping you around a little bit to get you to that space where you have maybe a higher understanding of things playing out as they should, even though in the moment they're not exactly, right? So yeah, sometimes the spiritual reflection too of a Saturn in the 12th house person can be something that is painful, like, getting out of an addiction through finding recovery, or, sometimes Saturn in the 12th house people find themselves institutionalized, which is kind of a trigger, but it's something that can happen because the 12th house has to do with institutions. What I find though is, especially after the Saturn return, these are the most spiritually connected, understanding and acceptance, and also self-preservation simultaneously people that you'll ever meet, especially if they do the inner healing work that is required of them per what their specific sign is. thank you so much if you've made it through this whole video. I really appreciate you. And yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below, what your Saturn is, what your experience is, and I look forward to reading about it. Take care. Bye.